Okay. Hello and welcome to episode 107 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and if you look very, very carefully at the center of your screen, you should be able to see me. I'm just harder to see because I'm wearing a camo shirt today. Those of you who are just listening to this and not watching, don't try to see me. You won't be able to. And I'm going to adjust this a little bit, like this. Okay, so I might as well start answering questions. I mean, I suppose I could go on a long introduction that has nothing to do with any of the questions, or, well, it might have something to do with one of the questions. Talking about my aquarium, how I got it all set up 2 days ago. There's apparently a conspiracy that prevents people from buying female dwarf gourami fish, that you can only find males. It's hard even to order them. But finally, I ordered 2 female gourami fish, dwarf gouramis, from someplace in California that flew them overnight so that I got them within 24 hours. And actually, Reverend Teacher Father Fish explained to me the conspiracy about female dwarf gouramis just like less than a few hours ago, just like an hour or so ago. In a comment, he said that dwarf gouramis generally are not bred in the United States. They're bred like in Southeast Asia or something. And then I guess there's like laws against sending females through the international mail or something because they might like become invasive or something. So I think it has inspired me to maybe breed dwarf gouramis at some point in the future so that we can defeat this conspiracy against pet shops or aquarium stores selling female dwarf gouramis, because it's really a pain in the neck getting one. Also, I inoculated my tank with microfauna and myofauna. I got the leaves, the cultured leaves on the same day as I got the female dwarf gouramis. So that's kind of exciting. And somebody did suggest that I do a video just about my aquarium, explaining like the ecosystem of it and everything, which is a possibility. But my hornwort's kind of scraggy. I got that in the mail 2 days ago also. So it's going to have to buck up a bit just to make my tank more presentable. So anyways, with that as a kind of introduction, forward, preface, if you please, I'm going to start answering questions. And the first question is from Jeffrey, and I apologize to Jeffrey. He asked me this question via email. And when I've been compiling questions to answer, sometimes I don't look in my email because usually the questions come in comment sections under videos, or they are on the Discord server in the Q&A room. So, I mean, I missed it the first time, and then by the second and third time, it's like way down in my inbox, buried under a bunch of other emails. So I do apologize to Jeffrey. And so I'm just gonna, his question is the first question here. And he said, reading your book, and I came across the mention that Hindus do not eat garlic and onions. Could you explain the reason for this, and if it is something you practice? Well, the reason why Hindus do not eat garlic and onions, or a lot of devout Hindus don't, and also a lot of like Mahayana Buddhists don't either, is apparently because garlic and onions are not sattvic foods. Like going with the old Sankhya yogic interpretation of food, you've got the 3 gunas. You've got sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. And sattvic foods are the kind of foods that good Hindu swamis eat, which is grains, fruits, nuts, and dairy products. That those are considered to be sattvic food that are conducive to spiritual growth or just clarity and peace of mind, that kind of a thing. And I really don't remember if onions and garlic are rajasic or tamasic. Rajasic is it increases passion. You know, like meat or really spicy food would, it's supposedly, according to, the yogic interpretation of these things, it just increases your passions, makes it harder for you to become enlightened. And tamasic food, it leads towards darkness and ignorance. And I asked an expert on Ayurveda what a good example of tamasic food would be, and he said mushrooms. But it would include also like stale foods, food that's going slightly off. I would assume something like blue cheese, it's essentially moldy cheese, that sort of thing would be considered tamasic. And I really don't know which category onions and garlic fit into in this scheme, but it's not sattvic. And so that's why devout practitioners of Indian spiritual traditions will often avoid garlic and onions. There was some Chinese Buddhist pilgrim who traveled to India late ancient times, maybe early medieval times, to get copies of various Vinaya Pitakas, like the rules of monastic discipline, from various Indian schools. And he noticed that in north central India at the time, like the Ganges Valley, the Buddhists weren't eating garlic and onions or meat because they had converted, they were mostly Buddhists at the time, and had converted to a school of Buddhism that considered these kind of dietary restrictions to be important. So let's see here. So I guess I explained that, but I guess the second part of the question is it something that I practice? No, it is not. Although I eat whatever my woman puts in front of me, and she's a very good cook, and there is some onions in it, but she really doesn't go heavy on the garlic like a lot of people do. But it doesn't matter to me. I mean, onions and garlic are good for you, I'm pretty sure. And I really do not follow along with the yogic interpretation of the three gunas and the different kinds of food and so forth. I mean, I'm sure that there's some overlap between the system and the actual effects of these foods, but I just, from the Theravadan point of view, it's kind of like the New Testament point of view. It's not what goes into a person that defiles him, it's what comes out of a person that defiles him. So, yeah, I do eat garlic and onions, although not like massive quantities of either. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Skoladin, or Skuladin, and his questions are about future shock. And there was a book that came out in the 70s, I think it was by Alvin Toffler, if I remember correctly, called Future Shock. I may have read it as a teenager, but I don't remember it now. I just kind of remember what it's about. But anyways, he has a little definition of future shock before his questions, and that is, future shock is a sense of shock or anxiety while trying to cope with rapid change in society or technology. So that started mainly in like the 20th century. Maybe it could go back as far as like the Industrial Revolution, like the invention of the steam engine. That could have started things, I suppose, but it has been accelerating. Like technological and societal change have been increasing at an exponential rate. And I have read some science fiction novels, science fiction stories about how eventually it gets to the point where people just can't keep up with technological change and they just start having like psychological breakdowns and so forth. But let's get back to Skoladin's question here. How does society's future shock affliction compare to you when you were a fairly enlightened feral teenager? Well, yeah, I mean, it was when I was a fairly enlightened feral teenager, that would be like late 70s, early 80s, and already the book Future Shock had already been published and become a bestseller. So it had already started back then, but back then it was mainly technological, I think. So most of the future shock was coming from technology, whereas now it's beyond. I mean, technology is changing fast still. It's kind of amazing, But now you've got more like radical changes that people can't really keep up with. And that's just like the breakdown of traditional culture. So it was like I was mentioning in the Q&A last week. Nowadays, because traditional culture is breaking down, you've got more and more people identifying as cats, more and more people falling in love with artificial intelligence, just fake people or love dolls or whatever. It's just like the tradition that stabilizes society and stabilizes around like the family. And, it's like what normies do, essentially. You get a job, you kind of set yourself up so that you can afford to raise a family. You get the home, you raise the family, you got kids. If you're doing well, you can send your kids to college, that kind of a thing. And that's just completely breaking down, mainly because of efforts of globalists and the left. It's like importing all these millions of people from foreign countries into America or Europe or whatever. That's part of the plan, is to cause this traditional society to break down, because you've got all these different traditional societies that are like competing and none of them really wins out. And so you just have this sort of this salad of different cultures going on. It's no longer really a melting pot where people they adapt to the prevailing culture. I can't remember what it's called. There's a word for that. But now it's just they're bringing their own cultures and they're not conforming. And so that is another reason why traditional society is breaking down. But it's also just attacks on traditional society, attacks on the nuclear family, for example, attacks on this being a Christian heterosexual normie. They're seen as like the enemy. A lot of people on the left will say that the really violent, dangerous people are these normie Christians, just completely ignoring folks like Antifa and that sort of thing. Having my second cup of coffee today. So, yeah, that would be the main difference between culture shock now and culture shock when I was a teenager, is that, the culture shock due to technology is pretty much the same, but the culture shock caused by just the breakdown of traditional culture is just vastly beyond what it was back in 1980, say. So anyways, I forgot to read his little commentary to his question, which is, it's pretty bad now, but it looked pretty bad before. It seemed like the TV show Gunsmoke was kept on air around 16 plus seasons solely by the will of every black-pilled grandfather staring at a cathode ray tube. Yeah, old folks not really adapting to newer ways. That's been a thing since ancient times. They found some sort of graffiti scrawled on some, like a pyramid or something. This is like really ancient, talking about how the young people today, they don't respect their elders, they're rejecting their traditional culture, on and on. It's the same stuff that old folks have been complaining about with regard to young folks, since there have been humans probably. But yeah, it's way beyond that. It's way beyond that now. But trans people, or people identifying as cats, furries, this kind of thing, just walking down city streets and not getting a second look. That kind of thing. Maybe in San Francisco in 1980, it could have passed. But now you can have like a small town in the Midwest, probably, have some guy walking down the street in like a black velvet evening gown, and he's got nothing to worry about. And in a way, if people were enlightened, it would be a good thing, kind of like the way the left is interpreting it. It's sort of breaking down these restrictions and allowing people to express their individual creativity and uniqueness and so forth. But most people lack the wisdom. And when you deviate too far from what is just natural to a human being, and the left ignores even the idea that anything is really natural to a human being, we're supposedly like a blank slate with no human nature that is innate to us or any such thing, then I've digressed until I forgot the beginning of the sentence. But yeah, you deviate too far from just what comes natural to a human being, and you're deviating off into dysfunction and like mental breakdowns and so forth. Like, I have nothing personal against trans people, but you look at the psychological studies and they're way more likely to like attempt suicide, for example, because they're just not really adjusted anymore. You know, they've kind of broken loose and are just kind of spinning around loose, you know, on the verges of society in a way. And you can try to bring them in, but still, with regard to certain traits, you know, they just can't fit the mainstream anymore. And it causes alienation and just, you know, sort of, well, it causes all kinds of things. So I guess I answered that question. So I'll move on to Skula Dean's second culture shock question, which is, were there any effective ways to deal with future shock? And he's got the commentary here, which is, there were two ways which I've noticed that were successful. The first of which the Romans had used was to have philosophers scrutinize technology before it could go mainstream. Like the steam engine, which remained a miniature proof of work instead of becoming integrated into society. The second method, which the Americans employed, was science fiction. Readers of science fiction generally could cope better by being introduced to a concept by a plausible situation and therefore prepare for the future. Well, before I answer the question, I suppose I should give my commentary to his commentary, my sub-commentary. And I never heard of Romans using philosophers to scrutinize technology, because there really wasn't a whole lot of new technology. Like that steam engine thing was really a toy, and it wasn't the kind of steam engine like got invented in the 18th century. It was just the power of steam was just sort of blowing and spinning a wheel, but it wasn't like under pressure, which really do hard work. So, I mean, it was maybe a step in the right direction. Somebody realized that the power of steam could actually cause a physical system to move. But, I mean, it was a far cry from anything that could be turned into like an actual engine that could be used for pumping water out of mines or whatever. I guess that was like one of the original purposes of the steam engine. I think that might have been why it was invented, was for pumping water out of like coal mines. Because it went really slow at first. It wasn't something that you could use to, you know, power a locomotive or something like that. So, and yeah, I never really read about the Romans using philosophers to scrutinize technology. There wasn't a whole lot of technology to scrutinize back then. I mean, improvements in like agriculture, improvements in warfare, and that mainly came through, you know, the Romans are fighting someone like the Celtiberians in Spain, or the Dacians in what is now Romania, and they're taking hits because the enemy has certain technological innovations. You know, like the Dacians had this weapon called a falx that was hooked. So they would stick it past the Roman and then yank on it and like cut them in the back of the neck and so forth. So then the Romans had to improve their helmets to protect the back of their neck and all that. And they started using the Spanish sword, the gladius, as their main infantry weapon after they threw their spears. So let's see. Yeah, so I'm not sure about that, but the second one, science fiction. Yeah, I do think that people who read science fiction can maybe adjust to technological changes more easily than people who just read gothic romance novels or some such, or they just watch TV news or something. Although I have to admit, most science fiction authors, when they're portraying the future, they get it wrong. You know, there are very few science fiction authors who predicted the internet, for example. I mean, you read science fiction written like in the 1960s and 70s, and by the year 2000, we're going to be living in undersea dome cities, and we're going to have colonized Mars and the moon. And Larry Niven, one of my favorite science fiction authors when I was in high school, he even had dolphins in the United Nations by the year 2000. America and the Soviet Union would have just divided the earth up into the codominium, that kind of thing. Didn't happen. But still, I mean, it makes you more open-minded to technological developments and radical changes in society and so forth. So there is that. But now I have to go all the way back up here to Skuladin's or Skuladin's question, which is, were there any effective ways to deal with future shock? And probably the most obvious way of dealing with future shock is was not mentioned by Skuladin, and that is just kind of become a Luddite, become Amish, essentially. So the Amish, they're dealing with future shock by just avoiding the technological advancements. Or become a monk and just go off and live in a cave in a forest. That's another way of dealing with it. Just renounce the world. If the world is becoming too fucky for you to want to deal with it, renounce it, go off and live in a spiritual community or like an Amish type community, that kind of thing. But what other effective ways are there of dealing with future shock? Well, first you just keep yourself stabilized so that even if society's going to hell, you've got all these weird people that are just kind of, they're just deviating farther and farther from what used to be the mainstream. They're just getting way out there, identifying as cats, for example. You just do your thing. You just try to be as psychologically healthy as you can. You don't necessarily have to be a normie. I'm not really a normie, but just keep yourself grounded. And I mean, that is probably sufficient for most of the people who watch these videos. I think most of you are not identifying as cats or falling in love with inanimate objects and that sort of thing. Although probably a lot of us are addicted to the internet or video games or whatever. So yeah, I mean, that's one way of dealing with future shock, is just keep yourself in a drugged stupor, or just escape from reality by playing a technologically innovative video game or some such. But I mean, get out of a big city. I mean, you live in a small town, you're not going to have as much culture shock as if you're living in a big city. Not only the technology will be somewhat reduced, or your availability of technology, but also like the imported people from foreign countries that are not adapting to the culture, they're mainly in the cities. I mean, some of them might be like agricultural workers on farms or some such, but yeah, just kind of mind your own business and adjust your own personal environment to something that you feel comfortable with. So yeah, I mean, what else can you do, really? You can't really control what other people are doing, out there. So you just have to kind of tend your own garden and keep it, within your range of acceptability. So I think I'll just move on to Skuladin's next question here, which also deals with future shock, which is, what is the role of postmodern literature in the current year? And then his commentary to that is, unlike Western philosophers and science fiction writers who dealt with future shock by asking two questions, what is this and what does it do? Postmodern literature seems to be highly conducive to future shock and has subverted two virtues of early science fiction, the first of which, mentioned earlier, becomes downgraded to mere predictive programming in a dystopia, while the second, its ability to inspire and manifest the future, or meme magic, now only benefits those diluting the formless, sizeless slab into Plato's cave. Well, I'm not sure if that particular commentary helped me to understand the question better. What is the role of postmodern literature in the current year? Well, I mean, postmodernism is itself a symptom of what is causing culture shock. It's a symptom of sort of the breakdown of traditional culture into weirder and weirder stuff that is causing people's minds to be affected by weirder and weirder stuff, which is leading some people just off the beaten track into a wilderness from which many of them cannot escape. So postmodern literature, I mean, I've read a little bit of it. Largely, it's like self-referential. You know, when people in the novel are referring to themselves as characters in the novel, for example, or like in a movie, like the movie Fight Club, that's got some postmodernism in it. You know, it's like they're like at the end where he's, you know, it sort of finally gets to the point where it began. You know, he has like this is where I'm at now. You know, he's like tied to a chair with a gun in his mouth. And then it says how he got there. And then finally, when it gets to that point again at the end of the movie, they're saying, oh yeah, this is how the movie started. I can't remember the exact words, but you know, it was along those lines. So postmodern literature, you know, in a way, it's again deviating from tradition and getting into weirdness on purpose. And that's sort of in style. You know, it's sort of, for some reason, globalist philosophers think that this is what the world needs, is just to break down all the traditionalism, possibly, at least for some of them, so that people can just be programmed to become good neo-Marxists. You know, first you've got to get rid of all the old traditional stuff that's in the way of just converting people to being pawns in the brave new world. So a lot of postmodernists, like the early postmodernist philosophers, tended to be Marxists. So that's probably one reason for postmodernism, is deliberately to undermine like traditional national cultures and just replace it with this new globalist neo-Marxist kind of culture, which isn't going to work because Marxism just, it's like typical of Marxism to ignore human nature, just to deny the existence of human nature. You know, they go with the blank slate idea. There is no human nature. There's no animal instincts in the human animal, that we're all just blank slates. And so they can just program us. Once they get rid of all this other programming, which they're trying to do, you know, this traditional culture, they're going to replace that with the brave new world. And I don't think it's going to work. It's more likely to cause a collapse, and probably the collapse is not going to be replaced by this globalist vision. It's going to be replaced by barbarism at first, especially. So I guess I answered that question. I guess I answered that question probably 5 or 6 times per video at least. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Gaz. And Gaz says, do you have any questions for us? Well, if anybody knows about keeping hornwort in an aquarium, then please let me know. I'm very open to suggestions about the cultivation of hornwort, which is a strange plant. And it's got people really polarized in the aquarium keeping world. Some people hate hornwort. Other people think hornwort is just invaluable. So it's got good qualities and bad qualities. One good quality is it's very frondy. And so little organisms and baby fish and baby shrimps can hide in the fronds. And it's more conducive to having like a balanced diversity of species than if you've just got leaves or like boring flat-leaved plants, then things can't hide in that as easy. But on the other hand, hornwort, it doesn't have roots. It just absorbs nutrients from the tank water, which can then starve out other plants and so on. So yeah, my question for my viewers is, what do you feel about hornwort? And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, thank you for checking it out on G.C. Pande's book and your answer. He asked me a question about, I think it's the Sigalo Wada Sutta in the previous Q&A. And so I gave my answer, and then I checked it out in G.C. Pande's book, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism. And we pretty much agreed. And so this is what Nature Cure is talking about. It says, thank you for checking it out on, he said it has KC Pande's book. It's GC Pande. And what was the book's name? And the book is this, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pande, published by Motilal Banarsidass. And for anyone who wants to understand early Buddhism, what really early Buddhism was like, like getting back to the time of the Buddha, and like how even Theravada Buddhism has changed and evolved, especially during its first few centuries, then this book is really valuable. It's a little bit dated. The first edition came out in like the 1950s, but still, it's really an excellent book, especially if you understand Theravada Buddhism fairly well already, because he'll leave a lot of untranslated Pali words that a newbie wouldn't understand. He's discussing like the Samyutta Nikaya and the Anguttara Nikaya, and if you're such a newcomer to Theravada Buddhism that you don't know the difference between Samyutta and Anguttara, for example, you'd probably just study up on just elementary basic Theravada Buddhism before tackling this book. But this is really, it's one of the most valuable, important books I've ever read with regard to helping me to understand what the Buddha actually taught. Not just what Buddhism teaches nowadays, but what did the original historical Gautama Buddha teach? And of course, G.C. Pande, he doesn't know for sure either. All you can do is make educated guesses. The best you can do is make educated guesses based on the evidence. So he's good at that, although he was a high caste Brahmin Hindu. And so he does take sort of a Hinduistic slant when interpreting early Buddhism. Like, for example, he likes to see the Buddha as teaching something pretty much in accordance with the Upanishads, for example. So, once again, G.C. Pande's Studies in the Origins of Buddhism. I do recommend it. It's a good book. So, Nature Cure's second question, what other English books would you suggest to have handy? Well, one book that is out of print, and good luck finding it, is this one. The Earliest Vinaya and the Beginnings of Buddhist Literature by E. Frauwallner. Right there. And this is just a photocopied book that was sent to me when I was living in Burma. And the person who photocopied this, he found this book in the library of Harvard Divinity School. And so he was at Harvard Divinity School, and he copied this book just so I could have it. But if you read old literature on trying to understand what early Buddhism was like, this was considered to be like the gold standard. This was like a very important pioneering work with regard to how early Buddhism evolved, how and why it branched into different schools, that sort of thing. So this is a good book too, but good luck finding it. Then another good book for understanding early Buddhism is this one is published by the Buddhist Publication Society, Concept and Reality in Early Buddhist Thought by Bhikkhu Nyanananda. And this is, the entire book is mainly about the meaning of the word papancha and how the commentators didn't understand it and got it wrong. And he puts forth such a persuasive case that pretty much all Buddhist scholars or Theravada Buddhist scholars who aren't just like Burmese dogmatic followers of the commentary, that they all pretty much accept this book as correct, that the old definition of papancha as found in the commentaries is, and also as is found in the old Polytext Society Poly English Dictionary, has now been replaced by Bhikkhu Nyanananda's approach, which is probably right. I agree with him on that. And there's another book on my bookcase that I forgot to get. Maybe I'll do it in just a second. Let's see here. Oh, here it is. If you want to know like the early history of Buddhism and like the different schools that evolved and so forth, this also is a good book. Indian Buddhism by A.K. Warder, which is also published by Motilal Banarsidass. Although A.K. Warder, he's good up until the very beginnings of Buddhism, because he has this relatively naive understanding of Buddhism that anything found in the core texts is probably what the Buddha really taught. And the core texts are the first 4 Nikayas and the first 4 books of Vinaya. And if you don't know what that means, that's fine. And also the first several books of the Khuddaka Nikaya. And he just assumes that because, if all of the ancient schools of Buddhism had these same texts, then that indicates that, it's like original teachings of Buddhism. But there was like 100 years before these different schools started dividing up. And so all it really indicates that anything that's found in the core text, anything that is common to most or all of the earliest schools of Buddhism, all it means is that it predates the first schisms, which were about 100 years after the time of the Buddha. And a lot of change can happen in the first 100 years. I mean, look at the history of Christianity. It just had explosive mutating growth like a virus in its first century of existence. And the same thing happened with Buddhism. So there is that. But those are my main recommendations for anyone wanting to understand like early Buddhism and just early Indian Buddhism. There is another book that I don't have on my bookcase. I donated it to a monastery library in Burma, which is by Richard Gombrich, which is How Buddhism Began, the Conditioned Genesis of the Early Teachings. So that's interesting too, and it's dealing with pretty much the same stuff as Pande's book, but I do not think Gombrich, even though he was president of the Polytech Society, he was a professor of Sanskrit at Oxford, I think it was Oxford, maybe Cambridge, but he was not a Buddhist, and he had this Oxbridge, upper crusty, common sense kind of attitude towards understanding Dhamma, and he just kind of misses the boat a lot of the time. There is one interesting chapter about whether Angulimala was an early devotee of Kali, which is kind of interesting. But I don't think that Gombrich really understood Dhamma very deeply. And I mean, even A.K. Warder here, I don't think, he doesn't understand it as deeply as Pande does or as Bhikkhu Nyanananda did. But just read books and study up and try not to get led astray and follow your own common sense, and you should make some progress. So I'm just going to move on to Nature Cure's third question, which is, do you still have English-speaking Burmese bhikkhu friends in Myanmar in contact today? Well, I never really had many English-speaking Burmese bhikkhu friends in Myanmar. Some of them spoke broken English, and that was about it. So yeah, I don't still have English-speaking Burmese bhikkhu friends in Myanmar. I mean, there was an Indonesian monk who lives in Burma. I think he might spend the rest of his life in Burma, who when I disrobed a few years ago, I sent him an email, and he's mostly living remote out in the woods, and with no contact of cell phones or email and that sort of thing. So it was like just relatively recently, within the past year anyhow, he finally got back to me and was giving me the update on this monastery we both lived at and so forth. But yeah, I'm not in any kind of regular contact with anybody in Burma right now. So I guess I answered that one too. So I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, are there any monks that you are intimidated by in Burma throughout your time living there as a monk? And I can only remember one monk who really intimidated me in Burma, and that was U Pandita. And ironically, he attended my ordination ceremony. He was present at my ordination ceremony in California when I was ordained. And back around 1997, it was like the winter of 97, 98, I spent a few months at Pande and he just disliked me from the very get-go. And he was kind of an angry, irritable sort of a person. I mean, he's considered to be a meditation master. And if you see him meditating, I mean, you can just feel this different, it's like a different atmosphere in the room when he goes into like this deep state. He becomes sort of like a conscious statue. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, you know, he just becomes like sort of strangely still, you know, just he's like a rock sitting there, but just the whole feel in the room changes. And he was apparently a meditation master, but it didn't stop him from being a very angry and frequently hostile person. And he was just continually just chewing me out for one thing after another. It was like, when I first went there, when I first came to ask him for permission to meditate at his monastery for a few months, you know, I told him that I was having difficulty with udacha, or just like agitation of mind. Like my mind is restless. It doesn't settle down easy, which is common for compulsively thinking Westerners. And he kind of looks at me like a plumber investigating leaky pipes. And he says, "Have you ever taken drugs?" And I mean, most Western monks of my generation have at least smoked some marijuana in their time. So I said, "Yeah, I've taken some drugs." And he said, "That's it. Drug addiction has damaged your brain." And I'm like, I've never been addicted to anything, not even tobacco. You know, it just kind of runs in my family. My mother especially had this nervous, restless mind. You know, she just had a nervous disposition. And without skipping a beat, he said that it is a combination of drug addiction and mental illness. And that was it. Like the whole rest of the time I was there, I was the drug addicted, brain damaged. I was the brain damaged drug addict, essentially. And he'd keep bringing it up. You know, don't just sit there like you're high on drugs, that kind of a thing. And so my first month there, I was kind of intimidated by him because he's continually getting on my case, until finally, after I'd been there about a month, I mean, seeing this meditation master who's like pissed off and hostile on a daily basis, I just stopped being afraid of him. You know, it's like he'd chew me out and I'd just sit there as placid as a cow. And I think that bugged him even more. It caused him to like me even less because I was no longer intimidated by him. But my first month there, I was fairly intimidated by the guy. And he may really have been a meditation master. I mean, he's got high profile Western Dhamma teachers today who were his disciples. So I just have bad karma with teachers, to tell you the truth. Like for someone else, he's a meditation master, a great sage, possibly semi-enlightened being. And then I just get like the worst side of him. Karma, I guess. So yeah, if I ever do produce my fourth book, there's going to be a detailed chapter on my few months at Pande, just discussing the stuff that was going on. It caused me to have a little bit less faith in the Mahasi tradition. Anyways, yeah, that's the only one I can really think of. The only monk in Burma that really intimidated me, at least temporarily. I don't really intimidate very easily. So anyways, the next question is from Ron. And Ron says, what if there was a group of Christians who believed, i.e., that is, had faith that Jesus was a run-of-the-mill gay or queer person who told parables, that there was nothing wrong with Philadelphia freedom. And I assume Philadelphia just means brotherly love or male homosexuality. I just assume that, because otherwise I don't know what Philadelphia freedom would be. Anyways, continuing with Ron's question here, and that group didn't try to convert people into becoming rainbow Christians. Could that work in your world? Well, I mean, the main problem here is that towards the beginning that, let's see, what if there was a group of Christians who believed or had faith that Jesus was a run-of-the-mill gay or queer person? Well, I mean, any run-of-the-mill person who starts a spiritual tradition is going to be starting an unenlightened and largely foolish and delusional religious system. So I mean, whether he was queer or not would be irrelevant. If he was just a run-of-the-mill person starting a religion, then, I mean, how are you going to get liberated following the teachings of someone who is not liberated? If they're just some normie, some gay normie, saying that it's okay to be gay, then, I mean, it's not so much their gayness as their norminess that is going to turn that into just a spiritually destitute spiritual system. So, I mean, one of my first gurus, one of my first spiritual teachers, one of the main people that really got me onto a spiritual path was Ram Dass, and he was bisexual. I think he was more comfortable sleeping with men than with women. So, I mean, that part of it is largely irrelevant, so long as they're not like wearing it on their sleeve and like promoting like special queer spirituality or something. So long as it's just spirituality to help people become enlightened, then there's nothing wrong with that, regardless of who he's sleeping with, if he sleeps with anybody. One of the best teachers I ever had also was gay. He was an English teacher named Mr. Van Vactor. So that part of it is largely irrelevant, I think, although you would expect that a really enlightened being would probably be celibate. Probably, not necessarily, but probably. At least going with Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, any fully enlightened being would definitely be celibate. So, yeah. So, I mean, if Jesus was gay or not, I mean, I don't think he was. I mean, and I've been catching flack even from assuming that Jesus even really existed as a historical person. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Jesus was really a human being, even though maybe all of the stories attributed to him didn't originate with him, they just sort of added on later. And let's also assume that Jesus was gay, then, yeah, I mean, so long as he's not making an issue of it, I don't think it's really an issue. But it's mainly the run-of-the-mill aspect of any spiritual teacher is going to make what they teach run-of-the-mill, which is not going to get anybody enlightened, unless they do it in spite of the teachings rather than because of them. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Frederick, whose name changes every few weeks. So this is the first time he's asked questions under the name of Frederick. But that's okay. Some people change their name a lot. Which in a way is kind of good. I mean, it's to identify with a word. Like, I've never really identified with my name much. So I'm called by 3 different names at least by different people, and it's fine. I don't really care. It's just a name. So anyways, Frederick says, if Didymus Judah Thomas was really the identical twin of Jesus, as Syrians and Indians had believed, what if Jesus appearing to Peter and James after his death was just some practical joke by Jude Thomas that came out very wrong or right for our civilization? So what if doubting Thomas, the apostle Thomas, was really the identical twin of Jesus? And I don't think so. I really don't think so. I don't think he was any brother of Jesus. I think he was an apostle. But assuming, for the sake of argument, that doubting Thomas was the identical twin of Jesus, then Jesus appearing after his death, like helping the apostles catch fish, that kind of thing, or on the road to Emmaus or whatever, was just a practical joke by Thomas. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, he appeared to Thomas himself, according to the New Testament, and Thomas, because he was doubting Thomas, he was doubting that Jesus really did come back after he died, and then Jesus says, stick your hands into the holes and stick your finger into the hole in my hands, and that kind of thing, just to prove to Thomas that he really did die and then came back. But this kind of question is, it's a hypothetical question on top of another hypothetical question is like, what if Jesus was a gay normie? Now it's, what if the apostle doubting Thomas was Jesus's identical twin who had a tendency to make practical jokes on people? Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think Jesus was a gay normie, and I don't think that the apostle Thomas, doubting Thomas, was Jesus's identical twin with or without the practical jokes. So, I mean, assuming that it did, I mean, it would just add just a little bit more to the legends, really. I mean, even if we assume that doubting Thomas really was Jesus's identical twin and that he masqueraded as a resurrected Jesus to fool some of the other apostles, then, I mean, it certainly wasn't a deciding factor on whether Christianity was going to become a world religion or not. There's a good chance that those stories were invented. Like the road to Emmaus, it's like his own apostles didn't even recognize him until later. So it's like maybe they just met someone who had a weird vibe, and then later they thought, wow, that must have been Jesus, because it didn't even look like Jesus when he came to them on the road to Emmaus. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that it really matters. I don't think it would have changed anything significantly whether Thomas pretended to be Jesus resurrected from the dead or not. I think the course of events would be essentially the same either way. And so I'm going to move on to Frederick's next question, which is, I never was really interested in Tibetan Buddhism, but now I am watching university level course on Tibetan Buddhism and the history of Tibet. Professor here says that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a 14th century fraud. Is it true? Well, I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead many years ago, before I was a monk. And I don't recall if it even states who the author of the book is. Maybe it's attributed to like Padmasambhava or something. But I mean, a lot of texts are attributed to people that really didn't compose the text. And so, I mean, Mahayana Buddhism, most of the texts in Mahayana Buddhism are probably this kind of what Frederick here is calling fraud. It's a forgery. It's supposedly by one person, but really it was written by somebody else. That's extremely common. You find it in the Bible. You find it in early Buddhist texts. You find it in later Buddhist texts. You find it in probably Hinduism, I assume. I mean, probably in Islam. It's just universal that people will write scriptures and attribute them to the founder of the religion or to some heavy hitter of the past. And it's like a forgery, like the mystical theology of the Pseudo-Dionysius. I mean, that's like a basic text. It's like one of the earliest mystical texts of Christianity. And it's now, I mean, it was the person who supposedly wrote it was Dionysius the Areopagite, and now he's called the Pseudo-Dionysius because, in all likelihood, he was like a Neoplatonist philosopher who, after the Emperor Theodosius shut down the Greek philosophical schools, he just figured, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and converted to Christianity and just brought his Neoplatonism, a lot of his mystical ideas into Christianity and started propagating them so that Christianity has become more Neoplatonist as a result. There's a lot of Greek philosophy mixed in with Christianity that most Christians even are oblivious to. So, whether the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a 14th century fraud or forgery, there's a good chance of it, but I don't really think it matters all that much. I mean, if the information in it is still largely true, I don't know who it's attributed to. I don't think it's attributed to the Buddha anyway. So, I mean, if it is helpful to people who are dying and helpful presumably to people after they die, telling you what you're going to experience after you die. And a lot of it matches up fairly well with near-death experiences. It's like, you rise up and you go into the light and you come out and there's this higher world, and you're meeting all these different beings and all that sort of thing. That's in the Tibetan Book of the Dead also. So, it could be a useful book regardless of who wrote it or when. And I might be seen as hypocritical for saying that because I'm such a stickler with regard to, did the Buddha really teach this or not? But mainly as a Buddhist, I wanted to follow what the Buddha taught. And so I wanted to find out what this enlightened being called Gautama, what he really taught so I could follow it, because I didn't want to follow just later mutations of Buddhism. I didn't want to just follow along with like some Southeast Asian tradition. I wanted to know what the earliest Buddhism taught, and I wanted to follow that as well as I could. So, with regard to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, though, Tibetan Buddhism has already deviated quite a distance from the earliest Buddhism. So I don't think it would be that much of an issue as to whether it's one of these books that were found. It's like somebody in the comments under the YouTube video answered this question to some degree already, saying that it's just common in Tibet that you have these found texts. Like Padmasambhava, he would hide texts in caves in Tibet, and then hundreds of years later, when people are more ready to receive these teachings, they would be found by, I can't remember what they're called, not a tulku, but there's a certain name for people who find these texts. And some of these texts, probably the overwhelming majority of them, were just forgeries. Like the Tibetan text talking about how Jesus came to Tibet and studied Tibetan Buddhism and then went back and became the Jewish Messiah, that kind of a thing. Almost certainly that kind of stuff is just forgeries. But with regard to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's fascinating reading, and it may help one to understand like near-death experiences, for example, because there is a lot of overlap. So, I really don't have a dog in this fight. I don't really care that much how ancient the Tibetan Book of the Dead is. I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist, so I can accept whether it was written in the 14th century or the 4th century or the 4th century BC. It doesn't really matter to me. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, what stage of enlightenment do you think you achieved? Check and make sure it's recording. It's an old habit. It's hard to break, but it is good to check. And yes, indeed, we are recording. So you're going to see this if you bother to watch it. So anyways, Joe Doe says, what stage of enlightenment do you think you achieved in? I've answered this kind of question before, and I don't even bother to go there. I'm not sure what the stages of enlightenment really are, because like the whole 4 stages of enlightenment, starting with stream enterer and then sakadagami and then anagami and then arahant, I do not consider that to be an original teaching of the Buddha. I think it got invented later on. So what stage of enlightenment do you think you're better off not even thinking about it? Anybody is better off not even thinking about it. Like even if you really have achieved some stage of spiritual advancement, that you're not going to be thinking, wow, I've achieved this stage of spiritual advancement, because like the Diamond Cutter Sutra says, which is a Mahayana text, even like a stream enterer, they've already overcome this self-view. And so they're not going to be thinking, I am a stream enterer. I attained stream entry. They've already gone beyond that. So you're better off just not even attempting to figure out or understand or categorize your level of spiritual attainment. You just keep doing what you do. Regardless, even if you think you know the truth, keep looking for it. Even if you think that you're some sort of great sage, then, you just keep practicing. It just gets in the way. Just this kind of thinking about what stage have I achieved and all that. it is really not particularly useful or helpful. So, yeah, it's hard to say, and I wouldn't venture to categorize my practice to that, or my level of advancement. I would say that I'm probably understand Dhamma better than the average Buddhist person, but that's just me. So I'm just going to move on to Jodo's next question, which is, did the Buddha say the unenlightened being is insane? Well, I think he's referring to a saying found in the Pali text, which is in the original Pali is putujino umadako, which means the common person is insane. So, I mean, that might let some of the higher stages of spiritual advancement off the hook, like an anagami. But, I mean, even an anagami, until you are fully enlightened, then you're going to have some delusion. So you're going to have at least a little bit of insanity. But like a total normie, yeah, I mean, they're just stuck in this world of delusion. They don't even realize that they're deluded. And, they just think that this delusional world that they live in is reality. So yeah, the Buddha did say that, or at least the texts say that the Buddha said that. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from GameFap. And I have to admit, I will make the observation that this particular Q&A has a larger number of sort of off the wall kind of questions that really don't have much to do with Dhamma. And GameFap has asked two such questions. The first one is, what is South Carolina's barbecue like? And I'm not aware of eating any specifically South Carolina barbecue. I mean, there's a few barbecue places that we've eaten at, but whether it was specifically South Carolina barbecue or not, I can't really say. And personally, I've never really been heavily into barbecue. For some reason, there are just other flavor profiles that I prefer to that of barbecue sauce. So yeah, you're probably asking the wrong question. You're asking me. I'm really not a foodie. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure what South Carolina barbecue is like. I can't really tell barbecues apart. I wouldn't know the difference between North Carolina barbecue and like Texas barbecue. I would not be able to tell the difference. And so GameFap's second question is, have you tried any Carolina Reapers yet? And I don't think so. Yeah, I'm not the kind of person that eats a lot of hot peppers anyway. My father he liked really spicy food. Sometimes as a kid, when he would cook, it would be hard to eat the food that he would serve to us just because it was so hot. And he would go out into the garden and just be eating these yellow peppers that, just one of them would have me just rushing to get a quart of cold water to drink afterwards. And he would just eat them like popcorn. But yeah, Carolina Reapers, again, I don't think I'm unaware of having eaten a Carolina Reaper. And based on what I've heard about them, it's something that you probably remember if you ate one. In my entire life, the hottest pepper I ever ate was in some Vietnamese food. And it was a little green pepper that was kind of cone shaped. It was about the size of the sharpened part of a pencil. And I remember as a monk, some Vietnamese people offered this food. And I saw the little green peppers in there, no problem. And I bite into one, and immediately it's like warning lights are like going off in my mind. And I have to think really fast. Should I try to eat this or should I spit it out now? And it's like just the reflex of chewing. It happened again. I bit into it a second time, and that was it. It was just like, I just had to spit it out. And then I just drank all of the water that was in my little cabin. It was a traumatic experience, definitely. But what kind of pepper it was, I don't know. It was green and like an inch long and kind of cone shaped. And it was, I don't know why people would even do such a thing as eat these things. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Not Henry Porter. And Whether Henry Porter, the real Henry Porter, is watching this or not, I don't know. But this one is not Henry Porter. And he says, why is the goal to get off the wheel of samsara and cease to exist? Why is the goal to get off the wheel of samsara and cease to exist? Well, I mean, if you're going to cease to exist, you're going to cease to exist in a samsaric delusional sense. So you're not really existing to begin with. Like Eckhart Tolle says, anything that's real doesn't come to an end. It's only what is unreal that begins and passes away. So why is the goal to get off the wheel of samsara and cease to exist in a samsaric delusional sense? Is because you're trying to overcome delusion. And it's through delusion that you suffer. So you're overcoming delusion and suffering. I mean, different people have different emphases. Like a more head-oriented person will want to end delusion, whereas a more heart-oriented person will want to end suffering. But it's both the same end. I mean, it's the same thing. So the goal is to get off the wheel of samsara and cease to exist, although it's not real existence, is just to end delusion and suffering, essentially. Or to know reality, to stop being delusional, just wallowing in this dream world when you can be at an infinitely higher level of consciousness. And the next question from Not Henry Porter is along the same lines, I think. It's, if a soul has reached an enlightened state, why not continue reincarnation indefinitely to experience love, peace, and connection in different contexts? Well, first of all, there is no soul in Buddhism. So, I mean, that's just part of the delusion, essentially. But let's see here. If a soul has reached an enlightened state, why not continue reincarnation indefinitely to experience love, peace, and connection in different contexts? Because, I mean, it's like you can experience love, peace, and connection in different contexts, which is an infinitely thin slice of reality. Or you can just merge with the entire infinitude of reality, which contains all of that and infinitely more. So full enlightenment is infinitely better, not just way better. It is infinitely better than any kind of limited perceptual samsaric state. According to some traditions, there are certain beings, like Neem Karoli Baba up on the top of the bookcase up there on the altar. He may have been someone who is fully enlightened, but then nevertheless not in order to experience love, peace, and connection, but just to help liberate other beings. That they come back and just, there's even some Buddhist schools who think that even after you're enlightened, you can still choose to continue taking rebirth in order to help liberate other beings. But you don't need to experience love, peace, and connection in different contexts because you're infinitely beyond that. You're experiencing that plus an infinitude of other experiences just because you have merged with infinite consciousness. I mean, God doesn't need to assume these forms in order to experience different things in different contexts. That's delusion. It's like an infinitely thin slice of reality that has become self-referential and thinks that it's separate from everything else and becomes oblivious to most of what lies beyond what it identifies as. So, I mean, why would you want an infinitely thin slice of reality when you can have all of it? I mean, yeah, it's mostly people who don't understand what enlightenment means or who think that this is reality somehow. That, well, they'll think that maybe we're better off just staying delusional and just pervaded by unease. But it really doesn't work that way. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Drunk Druck. And Drunk Druck has blessed me with this question. Tell us more about your obsession with Father Fish. how did you become a big fan of aquariums? Well, when I was a kid, like maybe 13 years old, I had an aquarium, like a little 10-gallon community tank. And even before that, I've always loved animals. I've loved nature. I became a biologist. I studied biology in university mainly because of a lifelong fascination for and love for animals, especially. Plants, maybe not so much, but still, just animals fascinate me. Just the various forms they take, and it's just like the life force. Life has this quality that inanimate objects don't generally have, and that is that they are striving to remain in existence. They're adjusting and adapting and responding to their environment and so forth. And it's just this life force, like Schopenhauer talks about when he talks about will. It's just this will to like propagate itself and just like fill every niche. Just do as much as you can. And anyways, I've always been fascinated by that. And so I've loved animals. When I was a kid, I had lots of pets. I had hamsters, I had lizards, had pet salamanders, raised chickens in my bedroom, which was a bad idea, I have to admit. I had like this little incubator and I hatched baby chicks. But then when you turn them loose in the chicken yard, when they get too big to keep in your bedroom, you turn them loose in the chicken yard and they get pecked to death because they're at the bottom of the pecking order. They don't have a mama to protect them. It was a bad idea, I have to admit. So anyways, in addition to all that, I had an aquarium, this little 10-gallon aquarium. And I kind of cringe now thinking back on that aquarium. I had like bright blue gravel and plastic plants and that kind of thing. But I had this idea of getting another aquarium just because now I have a degree in marine biology. I like fishes and just aquatic life. It's just fascinating to me. Life began in water. And so, there's entire phyla of creatures that live only in water. They can't live on dry land. There's no terrestrial starfish, for example. No terrestrial jellyfish. So, I've always been fascinated by life and aquatic life. And before I became a monk, when I was in my mid-20s, I kept thinking about getting another aquarium going. So that, like, when I first became a monk, one of my main problems with meditation, like one of the main things I'd be thinking about instead of focusing on the primary object of meditation is, what kind of fish would I get if I had an aquarium? That kind of thing. And so this aquarium here is sort of wish fulfillment from before I was a monk, where I always wanted to have cherry barbs and just wanted to see what it was like to have cherry barbs. Now I got a little school of cherry barbs. I always wanted to get dwarf gouramis. Now I got 3 dwarf gouramis. So in a way, it's kind of a fulfillment of these dreams I had as a young person. But also, one reason why I like this aquarium so much is, my birthday was last month. And I could have saved a lot of money by getting something called a biosphere. And it was supposedly developed by NASA. And it was a glass ball, not a very big one, just a hollow glass ball. No air can get in, it's just sealed off. The only thing that can get in is heat and light, plus, like neutrinos or something. And inside that glass ball was some seawater, probably sterilized, I'm not sure. A little bit of sand. For some reason, that little bit of sand at the bottom was necessary. Some seaweed and some shrimp. And it was just a self-contained ecosystem. The shrimp would feed on the seaweed, and then they would pee and poop, and then that would serve as fertilizer for the seaweed. It was just this self-contained, self-perpetuating system, and I find that fascinating. I was really interested in ecology. There's a good chance if I hadn't become a monk, I would have gotten like a master's degree in some kind of ecology. Because ecology is interesting because it's like the interconnected web of all these different systems. It's like seeing the big picture. You're not just specializing in one genus of nematode worms, for example. It's like you're seeing the whole big picture. And so the company that made the biospheres actually went out of business. I was going to get one of those instead of one of these. It'd be a lot cheaper. And it turned out they went out of business. They got like cheap dumb imitations of it on Amazon, but I didn't want one of those. So now I'm kind of going for the whole balanced ecosystem thing in this aquarium. And I found Father Fish on YouTube, he's like the guru of the natural low-tech aquarium, where you've got a food web, this balanced ecosystem. It's like a microcosm contained in this glass box. And so it's just fascinating to me. So in addition to the wish fulfillment of cherry barbs and dwarf gouramis, it's like an Asian themed tank. So the fish species and the plants and everything, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, are from Asia. In addition to the wish fulfillment, there's also just this fascination of setting up a self-contained, self-sustaining living system. And I did fail Father Fish. I discovered Father Fish on YouTube after I had already laid down the substrate, which is just coarse sand. But it turns out that it's way easier to develop this ecosystem, this food web, if you have a layer of potting soil or some kind of dirt under the sand. Because then the plant roots reach down into that. They grow better than if the roots are just in sand. So I've got a challenge in that I'm going to have to develop my own soil. It's just going to be maybe 2 years of decaying plant material. I've got dead leaves in there and sticks and just fish poop and all that kind of stuff is eventually going to form a kind of soil that will then make the aquarium more ecologically balanced, so that ultimately it may be unnecessary to have a filter, to do water changes, even to feed the fish. That it's all just, you've got bacteria feeding on the decaying fish poop and dead plants, and then you've got protozoans feeding on the bacteria, then you've got like little crustaceans feeding on the protozoans and worms and so forth, and then you got fish feeding on that, and then of course the fish are pooping and peeing and then refertilizing the plants and refueling the bacteria and all that. So it's just interesting to me. And also, I've mentioned this before, long before I had a fish tank, that a kind of elementary meditation is a very calming, very nice form, pleasant form of meditation, is you just sit in front of a fish tank and just watch the fish silently gliding around. That it's for someone who's not good at meditation, or a normie who has no concept of meditation, you just got a stressful job, then it's very nice. You just come home, sit down in front of the fish tank, and just watch the fish just silently gliding around. And it's very relaxing and calming, and just has this soothing, clarifying effect on your mind. So there is a certain amount of dharma in keeping a fish tank also. But it's one aspect of dharma for me, though, is the whole microcosm aspect and the whole life force thing about how life just balances itself out. It's like, how do I put this? Like a lot of novice aquarium keepers, or just people who want like a sterile tank, that it'll get overrun by something. There'll be like a bacteria bloom and the water will turn all white and cloudy, or there'll be like some kind of little worm gets in there and just like has a population explosion. That's because it is not an ecological balance. If you've got all kinds of like a wide diversity of organisms living in that tank, nothing can really get out of balance, because there's always something eating those. And so if they start to explode, the population of the things that feed on them are going to get bigger and just cause the population to go back down again. So just having my own little world back there is kind of nice too. So anyways, I think I answered Drunk Druck's question, and there is a good chance I am going to produce, just for the hell of it, just a video just about that aquarium back there at some point. Although I think I may have already mentioned that my hornwort is kind of scraggly. I got it in the mail a couple of days ago, and I want it to kind of bush out and look a little greener before I start showing off my aquarium close up. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga-U. And Yuga-U says, please give us an opinion on Milinda and Nagasena dialogue. How legit is it? So he's referring to the Milindapañha, the questions of King Milinda. And King Milinda was actually a Greek general turned king. His real name was Menandros, and he was like the king of a relatively kind of a largish kingdom. He was one of the most successful Indo-Greek kings. So he had carved out some territory in northwestern India, maybe parts of what is now Pakistan. Menandros, he's actually mentioned in, I think it's Strabo or one of the Greek chroniclers mentions, or it might even be, what was his name? Who did the Plutarch? I think Plutarch mentioned him as an example of a righteous king. So, give us an opinion on Milinda and Nagasena dialogue. Well, first of all, it's not canonical that King Menandros or King Milinda lived like in the 1st century BC, approximately, like kind of around the beginning of the Christian era. So he was hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. Nevertheless, it's part of the Burmese Tipitaka. So it is canonical in Burma. It is considered to be canonical. It's part of the Burmese Pali Tipitaka. But as I say, it's much later. You know, I think the Thais and the Sinhalese do not consider it to be canonical. Like the Polytech Society does not consider the Milindapañha to be canonical. One thing I would say is that probably Nagasena was not a Theravada Buddhist. There is evidence that Nagasena was like a Sarvastivada Buddhist, and that area that King Milinda was king of was really Sarvastivada territory. There were other schools of Buddhism too, but the experts are of the opinion that Nagasena probably was not a Theravada Buddhist. It may have been adjusted a little bit to make it more orthodox for Theravada Buddhists. But also, the experts consider, I think A.K. Warder in this book might be one of them. He mentions the Indo-Greeks and Milindapañha and all that. He mentions that probably the Milindapañha has 2 parts. The first part is the older part, and then there's a second part that has a somewhat different vibe to it that is considered to be a later addition, which might be like the Theravadins adding something that's more emphatically Theravadan at the end of this thing in order to kind of bring it into Theravada more effectively. I've never read the entire thing, and based on the excerpts I have read from the Milindapañha, it's really not my style. It's sort of very dogmatic and kind of philosophical in a very kind of verbose, complicated kind of a way, which I do not think is really the best way of approaching Dhamma, by just, excess cerebral activity. But I mean, if you want to be literate in Theravada Buddhism, I mean, certainly wouldn't hurt to read it, to at least to know what it says. So that, I mean, you're familiar with it. You can make intelligent comments about it, for example. But the 2 main things I would say about it, well, 3 main things. One, it's hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. So, I mean, it's not really representing early Buddhism. 2, there's a good chance that it wasn't originally a Theravada Buddhist document. It was probably, some other school like Sarvastivada that maybe got adjusted to make it more Theravadan. And I mean, if you really wanted to be scholarly about it, you could read some other version of the Milindapañha, which might exist out there, from some other school, and see how they compare. And third, that it's really supposedly in 2 parts, an older part and a newer part. So the first half of it approximately would be the older, more reliable Milindapañha, which may actually contain, like information on an actual dialogue between the Greek king Menandros and this monk Nagasena. And the second part would be less reliable in that regard. It'd be all apocrypha, the second half of it. So I'm just going to move on to Yuga U's second question here. What is your opinion on all this anti-Islamic actions that are going on around the world. And I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to. Anti-Islamic actions that are going on around the world. I mean, there's like protests against like Muslim migrants in Europe that I've heard about. There's, the war between like Israel and Gaza, which, I mean, in a way, the Jews are attacking Muslims, although they're not attacking them because they're Muslims. Then, of course, you've got like the 969 movement in Burma, which is resisting, Muslim immigration. They're resisting, Islam getting enough of a foothold in Burma that it can start to take over, in the eyes of these 969 movement participators. So all this anti-Islamic actions going on around the world. I mean, aside from that, I mean, you've got the Chinese government that has been just persecuting and just genociding the Uyghur Muslims. But I don't see it all as connected, really. I mean, it's different reasons for it. I mean, probably the predominant reason, like in Europe and Burma, is just the native inhabitants of those countries not wanting like Sharia law in their country. They don't want people who are moving in and refusing to assimilate. Assimilate is the word that I couldn't think of earlier. And just setting up like mini Muslim countries in like inner cities and so forth. And Muslims, for some reason, on average, going with statistics, they are more violent than the average European or Burmese citizen. So what is my opinion on? I mean, I'm not 100% sure of what Yugu is referring to. All this anti-Islamic actions that are going on around the world. Different parts of the world have different actions, different reasons for their actions and so forth. So, I mean, in America, you don't see much anti-Islamic action going on other than some people who just do not want more Muslim immigrants. But, and they just don't assimilate very well. I mean, that's mainly the problem that they're having is just, the problem that they are perceiving anyway, is just you have these immigrants come in and then they just refuse to assimilate to the culture and try to set up a very foreign culture, based on Islam that they don't want in their own country, especially if they become intolerant and like, fanatical or hostile or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, that's my opinion, I guess, because I'm really not 100% sure what Yugu is referring to. It may be that he's referring mainly to like anti-Islam immigrant protests in Europe. It's like all a Muslim has to do is like stab to death some European child and people start protesting against it. And then they wind up in prison en masse for protesting against the child being stabbed or raped or whatever by some Muslim immigrant. So, yeah, I do think that people living in the citizens of a country should have some say over who is allowed to enter their country and take up residence there. But, I mean, the globalist agenda just doesn't give a shit about that. And it's causing considerable problems, and the globalists probably knew that was going to happen and didn't really care. They figured it was worth it in the long run. So I'm just going to move on to Yugu's next question. Give us 5 reasons planet Earth has any use of human beings. Well, I mean, how could planet Earth have any use of anything, really? I mean, any use of human beings. I mean, you could say that planet Earth is a conscious being called Gaia. But why would planet Earth have any use for human beings? I mean, the only use for human beings that I can think of would be it would cause the small g gods higher powers to take more interest in Earth because human beings are kind of interesting. I mean, obviously, planet Earth is more interesting than some dead planet like Venus, assuming that Venus has no life on it. So, I mean, just the weird stuff that people do, the weird changes that we are making to the planet it's the changes we're making on the planet are relatively minor because the planet is so big and we are so small. But that's the only real use that planet Earth would have of human beings that I know of. I mean, I can't see how there'd be any other significant impact. I think is causing some sort of higher beings, whether they're aliens or small g gods or angels or whatever you want to call them, to pay more attention to Earth, maybe have a little more influence on what's going on in Earth. Maybe they're more likely to intervene on Earth's behalf, that kind of a thing. But that's the only thing I can think of. So I can't come up with 5 reasons. I mean, ultimately, planet Earth doesn't have any use at all. Maybe that's what he's trying to get to, is that planet Earth really doesn't have any use for the human race. I mean, the Earth would be interesting, fascinating, even without humans, because you've got all these other life forms that are doing their thing, causing Earth to be just a much larger version of that aquarium, where it's just this balanced system, or at least what that aquarium I hope will someday become. So it could be fascinating for higher beings, and they're just watching to see what happens next or something. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from David. And David says, there are 3 methods to escape the cycle of rebirth and become immortal. Oh, 1. Okay, let me start over. There are 3 methods to escape the cycle of rebirth. 1, become immortal like a zoji. I'm impressed whenever people come up with stuff from Burmese culture. Become immortal like a zoji. To be reborn first, you have to die, and an immortal doesn't die. 2, complete annihilation on every level, nothing to be reborn. And 3, the third method is one of the Buddhist methods and involves freeing oneself from all desires and aversions. This method is least understandable, while the other 2 are self-evident. I'm not entirely sure that complete annihilation is not also a Buddhist method. What does it mean to be blown out, for example? Okay, well, with regard to his first method, to become immortal like a zoji, zojis come from Burmese folklore, I guess, and a zoji is like an alchemist or magician who has found the secret of immortality. So they are immortal beings, but they're not fully immortal. I mean, everyone's going to die sooner or later. I mean, what happens when the universe goes through heat death? Everything just runs down due to, what's the word? Man, I should remember this. Not inertia. Oh, gosh. It's the second law of thermodynamics. How can I remember the second law of thermodynamics and not remember the term? Anyways, everything just runs down. Like the sun has gone out. The sun has gone nova. The Earth no longer exists. I mean, what's this Zoji going to do? Just float around in space? Get sucked into a star and just stay sucked into the star, unable to die for billions of years until the star explodes, and then the Zoji shoots through space and he's just like tumbling end over end through outer space for millions and millions of years until he gets sucked into another star, or until the entire universe undergoes heat death. Man, how come I can't remember that word? It's weird. But there's the second law of thermodynamics. Everything tends to run down. That there's always a certain loss of efficiency. I think that's the first law of thermodynamics, is there's always going to be a loss of, nothing's going to be 100% efficient. There's always going to be a certain amount of friction or whatever that's causing, a certain amount of heat to be generated, which is lost to the system. Man, that is just so weird. The whole word is escaping me. So anyways, that's with regard to Zojis. I mean, even a Zoji is not completely immortal. So you're not going to get off the wheel of birth and death by becoming an immortal being, because sooner or later you're going to die. I assume that if someone just went up to a Zoji and just fired away at point blank range with a Mossberg pump shotgun, that Zoji would eventually stop being alive. So, I mean, they just sort of overcome the aging process, but still, they're not bulletproof, and they're not going to just be able to get sucked into a star and remain alive, sucked into that star. So let's just rule out number one. Number two, complete annihilation on every level. I don't think that's possible either. I mean, if we assume that Einstein is correct with regard to the four-dimensionality of space-time, time is just the fourth dimension. So even if you annihilate at point, let's say you annihilate tomorrow, you just poof out of existence tomorrow, the past still exists according to Einstein, according to the Theravada Buddhism also. So you still exist in time. You're still there before you poof out of existence tomorrow. But if time is just the fourth dimension, then in a sense we're always immortal. Everything's always going to exist. Or going with my theory of everything, which is the simile of the block of marble, then there's no way you can completely annihilate. You're always going to be in that block of marble. There's no way to escape from that. So you get to the third method. And he says the third method is one of the Buddhist methods and involves freeing oneself from all desires and aversions. So you just transcend the delusion. You are no longer fooled by the delusion, and it stops having such an effect on you. You're no longer enslaved to it. You're no longer captive to samsara, really. So that's really the only way is just to rise above the delusion. And then all the unenlightened you that is still there existing in the past, or the unenlightened you that is still existing in the uncarved block, become irrelevant because they were never real to begin with. See, that's one thing that a lot of people have difficulty comprehending, is that you never really existed to begin with. That we don't really exist as conscious beings. That this is generated, it's an artifact of perception. It's an artifact of delusion. So, I mean, it's not that you cease to exist, it's that eventually you realize that you never really existed to begin with, that there just is no self to be liberated. And so all these illusory selves that are stuck in time or stuck in the block of marble become irrelevant. So, let's see, towards the end here, he's got a question mark. Let's see, I'm not entirely sure what complete annihilation is not also a Buddhist method. Oh, I'm not entirely sure that complete annihilation is not also a Buddhist method. Yeah, a lot of people that don't understand mysticism will say that nirvana is just extinction, but that's not really the case. And then what does it mean to be blown out, for example? And I don't have the book here. Just a second. I'm going to go over here and do this and grab this book. And maybe I'll find it without spending 5 minutes searching for it, saying, where is that? Where'd it go? It's in here somewhere. Here. By golly, the very first page I opened the book to, it's just as a flame tossed by force of wind quickly goes to its cessation and subjects not itself to any designation, so the sage, released from the mass of names, quickly goes to his cessation and subjects not himself to any designation. So that's one of the earliest references in Buddhism, really, to what blowing out means, and nibbana or nirvana, regardless of folk etymologies and so forth. Like Ajahn Thanissaro tries to translate nibbana as unbinding, but literally it means blowing out. Right here, just as a flame tossed by force of wind quickly goes to its cessation and subjects not itself to any designation, so the sage, released from the mass of names, or the namakaya, quickly goes to his cessation and subjects not himself to any designation. So I think the idea originally in ancient India and I think Ajahn Tanisaro agrees with this. In fact, I think I got the idea from him, is that fire was a god. Fire was the god Agni in ancient India. And so the god was unmanifest. I mean, he was there in potential form everywhere, and he would just become like manifest in the form of a flame. But then when the flame got blown out, it wasn't that it really ceased to exist. It just went back into an unmanifest form. So that's kind of what your consciousness does. You know, it's like when you're an unenlightened being, you know, you've got your mind that's, you know, the flickering flame kind of a deal. But then when you get blown out, nibayadi, to blow out, then it just becomes unmanifest again. You know, it just kind of merges back into the formless infinitude, so to speak. So, and I might as well add, this translation of the Atthaka Wagga was excerpts from the Parayana Wagga that I wrote years and years ago. I mean, that would be another very important book, along with these other books that were asked about, with regard to understanding what the earliest Buddhism was like. In fact, the Atthaka Wagga, whoever translates it, you don't have to read my translation if you don't want to. And it's possibly the most important text for understanding what the earliest teachings of Buddhism were all about. So, what does it mean to be blown out? It's the mass of names is blown out. You know, it's delusion. It's the whole idea that this is reality. You just rise above it. You transcend it. You go beyond it. Doesn't mean that this goes away necessarily. It just becomes irrelevant. You know, it's not you anymore. You're not perceiving it as you anymore. So then again, what does it mean to be blown out? I mean, you're getting into the realm of stuff that you cannot describe in words because you can't really figure it out intellectually. You can't understand it or grasp it intellectually. This perception just cannot go there. It cannot touch it. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is another one of these questions that really doesn't have much to do with Buddhism. It is as follows. This is from White Ash Piper. White Ash Piper says, why is it that Halloween music seems spooky? Or is it? Muahaha. Why does Halloween music seem spooky? Well, music is itself a kind of language. It's a non-verbal language, especially if there's no singing. And it's sort of eliciting emotional responses. So it's like pattern sounds that cause certain emotions to arise in a human being. And I mean, that's one reason why I never liked country music, because I just never liked the kind of normie emotions that country music causes to arise. Whereas rock and roll, you've got, it causes emotions of like power and exhilaration to arise, which I appreciate more than the emotions that arise from some guy singing in a twangy voice with a twangy guitar about looking for love in honky tonks. So I suppose Halloween music is just the kind of music, the kind of pattern sounds that cause sort of a spooky emotional feeling to arise in the human mind for whatever reason. You know, it would tend to be slower music, kind of dark, slow, and sort of weird music. You know, there'd be like a feeling of weirdness to it. So, and that's the best I can do. You can just take that ball and run with it if you please, because I'm really no authority on Halloween music. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. We've been going for less than 2 hours, so golly, we're just getting started. Sort of. Rui says, hello, Panyo. An old acquaintance has recently decided to check out by fasting until the end. The process was relatively fast due to his old age and extremely frail health, ravaged by 7+ decades of polio. What do you think of this method from the karmic point of view? Well, I remember reading a long time ago, some spiritual teacher, I'm not sure who it was, it could have been Ajahn Chah, could have been Maharaji up on the altar there. I don't remember who it was that said it, but he did say that if you want to auto-terminate, and you're not supposed to say the S word on YouTube. If you want to auto-terminate, then the best way to do it is to starve yourself. And I think the reason for that is that you have plenty of time to change your mind if you're not 100% sure. And also it gives you a lot of insight into what it's like, because it's a gradual process. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if I were going to auto-terminate, not that I'm planning on it, but I don't think I would follow that method. But, this isn't the first case of this that I've heard about. I knew somebody else who had a dear friend who decided to just end it all. They had, health issues that weren't getting any better. They were just getting worse. And they were relatively elderly already. They just fasted until they weren't alive anymore. So, I mean, I think we should have the right to auto-terminate if that seems appropriate. That's like a Christian thing that, that the S word is a sin. Dante's Inferno had a special circle in hell just for people who did that. And, it's like you're rejecting a gift from God by doing that. But in pagan Rome, for example, sometimes it was your duty. If you were a soldier who dishonored yourself or dishonored the legion, then it was your duty to fall on your sword, for example. There's quite a few people who auto-terminated in ancient Rome, like what was it? Cato the Younger, I think, was one who, after he heard that Julius Caesar had won the Civil War and was going to be, dictator for life, that he just opened his veins, so to speak. And there's Antony and Cleopatra. I think Antony, he tried to fall on his sword and messed it up and it didn't work right. And he died a lingering death because he fell on his sword incorrectly. And then, of course, you had the samurai and all that who had their seppuku. But, I mean, what do I think of this method from the karmic point of view? I do think that it might be preferable to certain other ways. I mean, if you're going to cease metabolizing, regardless of why that is, regardless of, whether you're doing it yourself, it's an accident, it's old age, sickness, whatever it is, then you're better off in as conscious of a state as possible. I mean, you wouldn't want to just be drugged into a stupor on narcotics or something. You wouldn't want to die in a drunken car crash, that kind of a thing, because you want to be as alert and conscious as possible in your last moment. That, to some respects, the most important moment of your entire life is the last one, because that determines your bearing, your heading going into the next one. And that's why, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, when he got shot, he said, "Hey Ram," as he was dying. It wasn't like in the movie where he's saying, "Oh God, like they got me." No, it was like he wanted his mind focused on God as his last conscious thought, which would help him in his next existence, assuming that he had one. So it was like, "Hey God." It wasn't like, "Oh God, they got me." It was, "Hey God." He wanted his mind focused on God. And so, no matter how it is that you're going to experience your final moment, you should do it in as wholesome and conscious and clear and alert way as you possibly can. So for different people, that would imply different things, I suppose. That different people would have different best ways of ceasing to metabolize. So with regard to this person who was over 70 years old with polio and all that, I'm not exactly sure, how it would work for him. Because, I mean, going hungry for weeks, that can be very unpleasant. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the best way would be. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question, which is, what do you think of Ajahn Buddhadasa's notion of Dhammic socialism? And I have to admit, I really do not keep up with Thai Buddhism much. I mean, I was ordained in a Burmese tradition. The only Thai monks that I really know something about would be Ajahn Chah. You know, I've read some of his books. I've met and have seen on YouTube and so forth, you know, various, and read in books, various disciples of Ajahn Chah who talk about Ajahn Chah. Also, Ajahn Mun, I read his really bizarre autobiography that was maybe it was a biography written by Ajahn Mahabua. I know a little bit about Ajahn Mahabua, and that's about it. I don't really know very much about Thai monks, like famous ones, like Burmese monks, like Mahasi Sayadaw or Ledi Sayadaw or, you know, Shui Umin Sayadaw or Tongpulu Sayadaw. Like these Burmese Sayadaws, I know significantly more about their biographies and their, you know, what their teachings than I do about Thai Buddhism. And Ajahn Buddhadasa, I really don't know hardly anything about him, so I don't know what his notion of Dhammic socialism is. I mean, socialism can be Dhammic, but you'd have to have relatively wise people participating in it. I mean, any kind of communism, like, you know, if everyone was an arahant, then you might just naturally have a kind of communism because nobody would have any idea of I, me, mine. There would be no personal property. Everyone would just share equally. But normies don't make good communists nearly as well as advanced sages do. It would have to be voluntary for starters. Like in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, it was essentially a communistic system. I've brought this up in Breitbart comments before and just get massively downvoted because Christians don't want to think that Christianity has anything to do with communism. But you read the Acts of the Apostles and it was everyone would pool their resources and it would be distributed according to need, which was communistic. You know, they had a commune going. You know, the earliest apostles of Jesus, the ones in Jerusalem anyway. But it has to be voluntary. You can't just force communism on people that still have natural human greed, for example, selfishness. It just doesn't work very well. And so then you have to enforce it at gunpoint and have, you know, secret police pounding on doors in the middle of the night. So Dhammic socialism, I mean, any kind of socialism, I suppose, can work so long as it's voluntary. But the more, I mean, the less advanced the people are, the less likely it's going to be successful. Like socialism, it just blows my mind that you still have people who endorse Marxism, for example, despite over a century now of stagnant and failed economies, totalitarianism, and occasionally genocide. It's like no amount of evidence to the contrary is going to persuade these people that Marxism sucks, that it's just a horrible idea. It might look good in theory, you know, it might look good on paper, but when it's tried in reality, it doesn't work. But what Buddhadasa's notion of Dhammic socialism is, I'm not sure. I mean, even monks, according to Theravada Buddhism, they're not completely communistic or socialistic. I mean, they are allowed to have personal property. At the very least, they own the 8 requisites. You know, they got their bowl and their robe and their belt and their water filter, their razor and their needle. And probably a sitting cloth too. So, yeah, I'm just kind of rambling, compensating for the fact that I really don't know what Ajahn Buddhadasa's notion of Dhammic socialism is. But socialism in general, you know, a certain amount of socialism is a good thing, I suppose. Like I mean, if everything was private property, you know, the highways would be private property, you know, just everything. It'd be owned by somebody. It wouldn't be owned by the people at large. You know, like there'd be no national parks, you know, no public highways, no postal service, anything like that. It would all be capitalized. And I mean, to some degree, having capitalistic competition, like, the Postal Service is competing with like UPS and FedEx and so forth, which causes them to be on their toes. If you have a monopoly on something, it tends to go downhill, because if you've got capitalistic competition, it keeps the quality of the product higher and the price lower. Because if you have a monopoly, then you got crappy quality and high prices. So let's see here. I forgot where I was going with that, but I guess it's sufficient in and of itself. Oh yeah, a certain amount of socialism, public schools and so forth for people who can't afford to send their children to private schools. It kind of makes sense. But when you're getting up to the level of equity where everyone is supposed to get equal outcome, then it just completely ignores that some people are clever, other people are stupid, some people are energetic, other people are lazy. It's like the people who are smart and work hard and have a good work ethic, they should do better than the people who don't. And instead, the people who don't just complain and vote Democrat with their hands out for free handouts. So, yeah, socialism in general does not work very well. Although inoculating a certain amount of it, it's like, I'm not even opposed to a certain degree of socialized medicine, where you've got, this existed way back in the 1960s and 70s, where you had free clinics. You wouldn't go there to get surgery or anything, but at least, you'd have some trained doctor or nurse who would look you over. And, if it was something that could be fixed with some pills and you didn't have the money, they'd give you the pills. I'm not opposed to that, but just to have the government playing God, like Canada's starting to do, where they're picking and choosing, well, you're going to be too expensive for the taxpayers for us to cure you, so you're just going to have to die. And, this kind of thing, you're better off just kind of leaving that to your own cleverness and industry to decide whether or not you can afford to get yourself fixed. Too much compassion pretty much destroys Darwinian survival of the fittest and pretty much destroys any kind of positive direction of evolution. When, the sickest, stupidest, laziest people are having the most kids, then what is to be expected of society a generation or two down the road? It shouldn't be that hard to figure out. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. I'm just kind of rambling at this point. The next question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, after I belch slightly, one more time. Okay. Romeo says, as I understand it, there are 6 personality types according to Theravada Buddhism. The 3 unwholesome types are aversive, or dosa, greedy, or lobha, and deluded, or moha. And the 3 wholesome ones are faithful, or saddha, wise, or pañña, and thoughtful and inquiring, or vitakka. In one of your past Q&As, you made a brief reference to how the aversive personality type may be more apt to achieve enlightenment due to their being easily irritated by samsara and thus less attached to it. As such an aversive type, I found that insight very eye-opening. Well, good. So his first question here, with that as a preamble, is, do you have any other insights or advice for the aversive personality type? Well, this whole system of 6 personality types comes from the Visuddhimagga, which is not canonical, but it's the main commentarial work in Theravada Buddhism. So, well, I won't go there. I'll just continue here. So, do I have any other insights or advice for the aversive personality type? There's not really a whole lot of discussion of these 6 personality types, but it does say that the best meditation for an aversive personality type would be metta meditation, where you're cultivating loving kindness. Although meditation on the breath is beneficial for pretty much everybody. Mainly it's good for people who think too much, but it works for everybody. So do I have any other insights or advice for the aversive personality type? Well, that would be the main one from the Visuddhimagga. The Visuddhimagga recommends metta meditation for people with the dosa personality type. But other insights or advice for people with the dosa personality type is, I mean, you have to be mindful and do your best not to take out your aversion on other people. I mean, if you restrain your outward words and actions, then it can be to your advantage, because it does help you to turn away from worldliness and live a more spiritual life. Because if you're irritated by everything, then it helps you to just start avoiding the world, just renounce the world and strive for enlightenment. But of course, you have to be careful about taking out your aversion, your dosa, onto the beings around you, because then you're making bad karma for yourself. I mean, you're making bad karma anyway just by having aversive thoughts. I mean, that's in a way you're playing with fire. So, I mean, you shouldn't just wallow in it, but it can help to guide you away from the world and worldliness. If you've got aversion for the world, it's easier to renounce the world. But still, you have to be careful, because dosa is an unwholesome mental state. And the more you indulge in that, especially if you're externalizing it by, making snotty remarks at people, or, whatever it is, cutting somebody off because you're mad at them on the street or whatever, then you're going to be making bad karma and just making things more difficult for yourself at the same time. So that was Romeo's first question. The second question, also based on this overall theme, do you have any insights or advice, both from your own observations and or based on Buddhist teachings, for the other two unwholesome personality types? Well, the Lobha personality type, the main meditation technique recommended for the person with the Lobha or greed temperament is the defilements of the body, the 32 parts of the body, the foulness of the body. So that's, I think, if I remember correctly, the Visuddhimagga specifically recommends that meditation technique for people with the Lobha personality type. And with delusion, I think it's meditation on breathing, just mindfulness of breathing, which is good for everybody. It's like a panacea. It works for everybody. So let's see. The other two wholesome, it's the person with the Lobha personality type, or the greed, the attraction personality type. They've got more difficulty from a dharmic point of view. I mean, they might be making less offensive karma. They're offending fewer people. Maybe they're causing less suffering to others through their actions and words, but still, it's like they're bound by a silken cord. Instead of being bound by a chain, they're bound by this silken rope, because they're attracted to pleasure. They're addicted to pleasure. And so it's much more difficult to renounce something that you like than to renounce something that you dislike. So, let's see here. Advice on the other two unwholesome personality types. Yeah, with regard to delusion, though, people with the Moha personality type, they're just pretty much stuck, because, to the extent that you're aware that you're deluded, you're not deluded anymore. To the extent that you are aware of your insanity, to that extent, you're actually sane. Or, like it says in the Dhammapada, the fool who is aware of his own foolishness is at least wise to that extent. So, with regard to the Moha personality type, or the delusional personality type, is just try to at least be aware of the delusion. Just know thyself. But it's hard, because you can be mindful of attraction and aversion, but it's virtually impossible to be mindful of delusion in the present moment. In retrospect, you can think, wow, I was pretty delusional at that time. But while it's happening, you cannot be mindful of your own delusion, because to the extent that you're aware of it, you're not deluded anymore. So, yeah, the person who is delusional and not even aware that they are delusional, they're just pretty much stuck. I mean, it's very hard to help such a person other than helping them in a superficial way, just by not hitting them with sticks and so forth, not poking at them. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's third question here, which is, which of these personality types do you or did you most resonate with? I remember when I was a junior monk and I was reading the Visuddhimagga, and it was mentioning these 6 personality types. And I asked one of my teachers, my main teacher, Venerable Utesaniya, which one he thought I belonged to. And he just started laughing. And he said, dosa. Because when I was a junior monk, I was very disillusioned. I was very idealistic going into the Sangha. I thought I was going to be joining the brotherhood of men who are striving diligently for enlightenment, and they'd all be wiser than me because they'd all been striving longer than me, because I was just a rookie. And then I actually experienced the reality of like an Asian Buddhist monastery where most of the people really are not striving for enlightenment at all. They just want to live an easy life or whatever. They just want to earn merit for a good rebirth or something. And I was very just dour, just sullen. And so, yeah, I definitely was predominating with dosa, just in the form of just sullenness back then. And, I can definitely relate. I think I'm kind of a mixture of various. I don't think I'm just one predominant type. I assume I've got sort of the intellectual, inquisitive aspect of personality to me. I've got a certain amount of dharma, just sort of the wisdom aspect, I suppose, along with a few others. So, yeah, I think it would be a mix. Maybe dosa and the vitaka and the bodhi, kind of a mixture of that somehow. I don't know what the proportions would be. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Maximin, who was the first barbarian emperor of Rome, allegedly. And Maximin says, I've heard you mention the left provoking mass hysteria, and was curious if you've researched the specifics of Project 2025, which is basically a Trump-adjacent plan to implement Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. Well, I mean, what does Trump-adjacent mean? I mean, it means that there are like ultra-conservatives who are going to vote for Trump just because he's the most conservative person running. I mean, and so they've come up with this Christian nationalism agenda that Trump was not involved in formulating, and he has distanced himself from it. And anyone who gives Trump a fair hearing, who listens to him talk, would know full well that Trump is not going to implement any kind of Christian nationalism or authoritarianism in America. This is all propaganda. This is the kind of mass hysteria coming from the left that has people believing that Trump is somehow some mastermind or some, even just some pawn or puppet of Project 2025. That's Trump adjacent, which simply means people who are going to vote for Trump have come up with this. It's like you've got communists who are going to vote Democrat because the Democratic Party is the farthest left party that is likely to win an election, that plausibly could win an election. Also, you've got like white nationalists and so forth who vote Republican simply because the Republican Party is the farthest left, or the farthest right, I mean. So, yeah, I mean, this is just an example of the kind of propaganda that the left is. I mean, they're just doing anything they can to throw shade on Donald Trump. So, yeah, provoking hysteria. I mean, seriously, like, compare Project 2025, which is just words on paper, essentially, that Trump might give just a teensy bit of attention to, but he's not going to implement it. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Anyone who knows Trump knows that he's okay with abortion, for example. I mean, he doesn't want full term. He doesn't want an abortion at 9 months. You know, he doesn't want just free abortions for anyone for any reason, I assume. But still, I mean, he's not like a Christian nationalist or authoritarian. That's just stuff that the left is saying against him to get gullible people to hate Trump. So, provoking mass hysteria, like the George Floyd riots, for example. It turns out George Floyd died of a drug overdose. That Chauvin's knee was kind of on his shoulder. It just looked bad from the camera angle, but he was doing what he was taught to do, to immobilize this guy who was freaking out and saying he couldn't breathe long before he ever got out of the car. Because in all likelihood, and they have film footage of this guy in a previous example of him getting arrested, of him just taking the pills before the cops can search him, just so that he doesn't have it on him, and he overdosed from doing that, apparently. And so then you've got billions of dollars worth of damage, dozens of people murdered. You have like pallets of bricks mysteriously appearing on street corners where the riots are bound to happen. All of this done by the left. And then you've got people like Kamala Harris saying, not only is this going to continue, but it should continue. They were endorsing this. Kamala Harris was actually helping to bail out these rioters who are just burning down Wendy's, for example, just running amok. And it's like the left endorses this, whereas the right, you've got, let's say, January 6th, where it was mainly nonviolent. It wasn't fiery, but mostly peaceful, like they were saying about the George Floyd riots. It's like you had unarmed people going into the White House or into the Capitol, I mean, ushered in by the police. The police were just letting them in. The only people who died a violent death were unarmed protesters. No cops were, I mean, then they just make up lies about like this cop who got killed from getting his head bashed in by a fire extinguisher. It just wasn't true. And that's supposedly the worst thing that's happened on American soil since Pearl Harbor, when it was mainly unarmed civilians going in protesting and taking selfies and then leaving again, a lot of them were just ushered in and guided around by the police. But the George Floyd riots, again, billions of dollars, dozens of people murdered, that's just fine and dandy because it was the left that was doing it. So, yeah, I have looked at some of the specifics of Project 2025, and yeah, I mean, you can call it Trump adjacent to your blue in the face, but I don't think Trump is going to do much with it, if anything. And I should just move on to the next question here. This is from Cleefy. Sorry for ranting a little bit there. Happens sometimes. So anyways, Cleefy says, why do Buddhist monks, especially Theravada monks, look miserable? Tibetan monks look much happier. Well, there's two main reasons why Theravada monks might look miserable. First of all, there's the whole ancient Indian ethic, which is found in Theravada Buddhism, that you should avoid pleasure. I mean, you should avoid pain and pleasure. I mean, it's like you're going for neutrality. A Theravada Buddhist monk, you know, you avoid sensuality, you avoid self-torture. You just try to go for this calm neutrality. And so monks aren't even supposed to laugh in public. Monks aren't even supposed to show their teeth when they're smiling in public. I actually got taken to task once by another monk because I was smiling and showing my teeth in public. And you say, you shouldn't do that. That's not good. So, I mean, there is that. But also in Theravada Buddhism, I mean, how monks appear in public is very different from how they appear behind the scenes at the monastery. I lived at monasteries for a long time. I've seen monks behind the scenes, and they're very different, especially Burmese monks, very different from when they're in public. When a Burmese monk is in public, it's like stone face. You know, they look modest, they're looking down, you know, they're not smiling or laughing, that kind of a thing. I mean, a lot of them, especially when they're going for alms round. They're really good at just looking like monks are supposed to look. But then when they get back, they're smiling and laughing and joking and just being silly and behaving like ordinary humans. And on average, it's pretty clear to me that the average Buddhist monk, like a Theravada Buddhist monk, a bhikkhu, has less unhappiness in his life than the average person. But the average person, they're smiling a lot of the time, they're frowning a lot of the time. And in public, they're going to be smiling more and frowning less just because of, they're in public. And it's like in Asia, especially, somebody losing their shit in public is extremely rare. Every once in a while, somebody will just snap and start chimping out. But as a general rule, I mean, it's just, you just don't do it. That you're always like relatively calm when you're in public. It's like an Asian thing in particular, I think. But if somebody really does lose their shit, they're just like yelling and raging in public, and a crowd starts to accumulate, and people are just staring in amazement. It's like, wow, how can he do that? So, Theravada monks, I don't know where the miserable comes from. I mean, they look pretty calm to me. It depends on what monks you're looking at, I suppose. But, there's two main reasons. One is you're just not supposed to show emotion in public, even though they show emotion back at the monastery. And two is it's just the whole philosophy, the whole ethical philosophy of Theravada is you're supposed to be avoiding the extremes of pleasure and pain. Or at least kind of steering the middle path between unnecessary pleasure and unnecessary pain. And so it's just sort of like this poker face. Whether Tibetan monks really are much happier than Theravada monks or not is hard to say. They might have more fun. They get to play soccer and stuff without it being against the rules or people criticizing it. But whether they have more serenity or not, more contentment, is another question. So I'm just going to move on to Cleefy's second question here. And he says, besides, do you realize that you are a bodhisattva, or at least you are doing the bodhisattva's job by spreading Buddha Dharma? Well, a long time ago when I was a teenager, I was informed that I was a bodhisattva by no less authority than the Diamond Cutter Sutra itself. Because the Diamond Cutter Sutra says that if you can read the Diamond Cutter Sutra and not be filled with alarm and dread, if you can accept it joyfully, you're a bodhisattva. And I like the Diamond Cutter Sutra. I never experienced like alarm or dread while reading the Diamond Cutter Sutra. So according to the authority of the Diamond Cutter Sutra, I'm a bodhisattva. But from the point of view of Pali Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, to be a bodhisattva, to really be a bodhisattva, which is someone who is destined to become a Buddha, who is like on the path of Buddhahood, not just becoming enlightened, like an ordinary arahant, but full Sambuddhahood, you have to receive what in Burmese is called a byadate, which means at some point, a Buddha, a Sambuddha, has to single you out and prophesy that you are going to become a Buddha in the future. Also, I think in order to become a bodhisattva, I think you have to have mastered jhana already. There's a few other qualifications that in order to be a bodhisattva from the older Theravadan, like Pali Buddhist point of view, there's these criteria that I doubt that I actually meet. So I might be a Mahayana bodhisattva, but I'm not a Theravadan bodhisattva. And I think just the whole idea of the bodhisattva concept is a later addition. It's an artifact of later philosophical developments of Buddhism, that the Buddha himself was not referring to Mahayana-style bodhisattvas. And bodhisattva just meant someone who is destined to become a Buddha, which was Gautama himself. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pseudonym. And as I keep saying, I doubt that is really his name. But Pseudonym says, please explain the essential difference between the intention of goodwill, or metta, and the intention of harmlessness, or karuna. So yeah, he's asking, I assume, the difference between the mental states of metta and the mental states of karuna. Metta is usually translated loving kindness, although something like friendliness or amity might come closer to the truth, because metta is based on the same word as mita, which means friend. You know, in Sanskrit it'd be mitra. And I think in Sanskrit the word for metta is maitri. So it means like friendliness, being a true friend. So that's one of the four Brahma Viharas, or the divine abodes. And karuna, or usually translated as compassion, is another one of the Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes. So I think Pseudonym is asking, what's the difference, like the psychological difference between metta, or friendliness, or loving kindness on the one hand, and karuna, or compassion, on the other. And based on the Pali texts, the main definition or meaning of metta is like wishing for the goodwill of others, wishing for the happiness of others, whereas karuna is sympathizing with the suffering of others. And sympathizing with the happiness of others is another one of the Brahma Viharas, which is mudita. So metta and mudita are closer together because they're both like attitudes with regard to the happiness of others. One is just like wishing for the happiness of others. The other one is like rejoicing in people who are actually happy. But karuna is more like sympathizing with others' suffering. So, I mean, that should be fairly explanatory, I think, that, you know, wanting the good fortune or happiness of others is somewhat different from sympathizing with the misfortune of others. They're kind of similar in a way, but they're not exactly the same. One is, you know, wanting others to be happy. The other one is sympathizing when others are unhappy. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tumulplatz. And Tumulplatz said, how did you get books to read when you were living in a cave in Burma? Well, there were various ways that I got books to read when I was living in a cave in Burma. Every few years, I would go back home, and my father would allow me to just raid his bookshelves. So I did get quite a few of my books, like in every 4 years or so. I'd go back to America to my father's house and just help myself to his book collection. So, you know, I'd be coming back to Burma with a suitcase full of books. So that was one way I did it. Also, when I would go back to visit my father, a few times he would just say, you know, go ahead and order a few $100 worth of books on Amazon, that kind of thing. So I'd be able to pick out books that I specifically wanted to read. Also, every once in a while, a supporter in America would just mail me a box of books. That happened at least twice. Although once was a very nice lady who just sent me like chick literature. At least there was a Charles Dickens novel mixed in with all the chick books. But it kind of got me interested in Charles Dickens again, reading Nicholas Nickleby. But another main way of getting books was in Mandalay, in the city of Mandalay, Burma. There was a bookstore called Down O Way, which is like peacock literature. It was a little bookstore, some dingy little bookstore in a crummy part of town that specialized in selling used books in the English language. And almost all of them came from before the military dictatorship, when the sanctions came down and everything, and Burma became like a hermit nation. So they were old English books. I still own a few of the books that I got at Down O Way in Mandalay. Like once a year, I'd go there with some supporter, and they'd have like funds for my benefit that I could make use of, and I'd just pick out any books that looked interesting there. So that was how I got a lot of books. And sometimes, I mean, you can just find you can be surprised by the kind of books you can find at, you know, like on a bookstall in Rangoon or in Mandalay. There was a few books I got at bookstalls in Rangoon too. Like I found an old copy of the Surya Siddhanta at a bookstall in Rangoon. It was just there. This book that was written like in the mid 1800s, just among all the other stuff. A few times I came across Mein Kampf at bookstores in Burma, like an old World War II era version of Mein Kampf, and I was tempted just out of curiosity, but I just couldn't bring myself to ask for Mein Kampf, somebody to buy a copy of Mein Kampf for me. And so that was how I got my books. I still had a limited number of books, and it was kind of good because when you're living in a cave alone in some remote area of the world, then any unread books that you have are going to get read. So they can be really difficult books. Like I read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in a cave, and there's no way in hell I could read that book now. Or, reading like really dense philosophy books, F.H. Bradley. I can't remember the name of the book. I've got it still on the bookshelf back there. Published in 1902. I had to cut the pages apart. Nobody had read the whole book yet, so I had to use a knife and cut the pages apart because it was one of those really old books where you had to use a book knife or a paper knife or something to cut the pages apart. And I mean, there's no way I could read a book like that now. I'm just being honest with myself. I don't think there's just too many distractions in the West for me to just wade through a really difficult, heavy, intellectual kind of book. And I mean, with regard to Hegel, and it's just as well that I'm not going to read any more Hegel because that was awful. That was like the worst ascetic practice. The most painful ascetic practice I ever practiced was reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. It really sucked. So let's see here. So I answered that question. And so I'm at the very last question. This is kind of a short one. This is less than 2.5 hours into it, and we're already at the very, very last question. And this is from Diane. And Diane says, if you try to make good karma every day, does that mean you are on some kind of path to enlightenment? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. Because in Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism, you've got two main good paths. You've got the good path for lay people, which is to do good deeds, to make merit, and then you go to heaven. Heaven doesn't last forever, though. After you've exhausted your karma in heaven, you have to, pass away from there and reappear somewhere else. It's still birth and death. But then there's the other path of the renunciant, in which you're not trying to do merit. I mean, you're going beyond good and evil, so to speak. You're going beyond merit and demerit. You're trying not to make any karma at all. So that would be the main path to enlightenment. But if you're doing good karma, doing good deeds, it's helping you, at least to the extent it makes it easier to strive for enlightenment, because you're going to have less bullshit happening back to you due to your own bad karma. So, you can get reborn in heaven. You can get reborn in a fairly trouble-free, comfortable kind of human life where it's easier to practice Dhamma than if you're just struggling for existence in some third world ghetto or in hell or something. So if you're doing good karma every day, that's not exactly the path to enlightenment, but at least it makes it easier to follow the path of enlightenment if you've got lots of good karma than if you've got more bad karma than good karma. But ultimately, if you really want to become enlightened, you have to leave behind all karma, good and bad, because like the Buddhist devil, Mara, if he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because even if you go to heaven, you're still in samsara. You're still in his domain. So the path to enlightenment is just transcending the whole system, which includes good karma and bad karma. Whereas to do good karma and avoid bad karma, where you're doing good and avoiding doing bad, that is the path to heaven. But heaven still isn't the highest state, and you're still in samsara. And even heaven doesn't last forever. But you're way better off doing good than doing bad. because, you're just setting yourself up. So, it's easier to renounce the samsara, to renounce the world, if you're in a good circumstance, than if you're just, dealing with affliction and misery and struggling to survive. So that is it. I answered all the questions. That's a good thing, I think. And so you guys already know, if those few of you who make it all the way to the end already know, that if you have any questions to ask, feel free to put them in the comments below. Or if you have access to the Discord server, you can ask me there. If you have access to the Subscribe Star site, you can ask me there. And you feel free to ask about anything you think that I can answer, especially if it has something to do with some kind of dharmic trend, meditation, Buddhist philosophy, Eastern philosophy in general, monasticism, Burma, me personally, that kind of thing. And in conclusion, I would just like to say, be happy.